Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Judy and I love travel, history, and figuring out why things happened the way they did. My channel is currently walking the different towns and fortresses of the Loire Valley, great stone castles that evolved mostly from wooden towers and keeps dating back to the 10th century into cold, large, and sometimes abandoned piles of stone that instantly capture a camera's interest. One of these castles sits above the Vienne River in Chinon. Between the time when Henry II Plantagenet modernized it in the 1100s and its final abandonment, it saw a great deal of history. Part of this history was the imprisonment and torture of the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a man named Jacques de Molay. This move, instigated by the King of France because he owed the Templars a great deal of money and needed to get out from under the debt, led to de Molay's eventual execution by being burned at the stake and had enormous consequences, not just for the Templars, but for the king who executed him and the country of France. Let's take a look at this story as the armchair traveler investigates. The Knights Templar played a significant role in military campaigns aimed at capturing and securing the Levant, or Middle East to us, during the Crusades. Their contributions were crucial in various aspects of the crusading efforts, particularly in the early stages. Their travel and fighting in the East required an enormous administrative and organizational effort, organizing the men who would travel and arranging to finance all of the work. One of these administrators was a man named Jacques de Molay. Unlike the great crusading generals of earlier centuries, de Molay left behind no famous battle victories. He likely fought in the desperate defense of Acre in 1291 and led later campaigns in Armenia against the Mamluks, but they ended without triumphs. His role was less about winning battles and more about keeping the Templars operating and their cause alive. At the beginning of the 1300s, King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair and shown here in hunting costume, found himself deeply in debt to the Knights Templar. During his reign, Philip engaged in several costly military adventures, and he waged it all on credit. To fund these wars, he turned to the Templars, who weren't just a military order, but also one of the most powerful banking institutions of their time. They owned enormous amounts of land and property and were really rich. The Templars had established a reputation for being reliable lenders, and many monarchs, including Philip, relied on their financial support during times of need. Philip's situation regarding his debts to the Templars was a combination of both desire and inability to pay. He wanted to avoid repayment as a means of consolidating power and seizing wealth, but he was also facing significant economic challenges inside of France that made actually fulfilling his financial obligations increasingly difficult. Essentially, the man was trying to stiff everyone he could and couldn't find any more lenders. History suggests that getting rid of his lenders would have been the easiest way for Philip IV to resolve his financial difficulties and to strengthen his political position. By eliminating the order, meaning the Templars, he could get rid of the debt, seize all of their property and wealth, consolidate power, and all the while frame his operations and actions as necessary for the defense of God and the faith. One of the earliest steps to do this, however, was to cut off the leadership of the order. He had Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, seized and dragged off to Chinon. Castles and even palaces represent more than just military or residential structures and venues. They generally have always held prison facilities, and in some cases the entire site was converted to a prison after the castle was abandoned for defensive or residential use. Chinon was still operating as a fortress, but it did have room for prisoners. Jacques de Molay was brought here and confined, most likely in Philip Augustus's Coudray Tower, shown here. That big tower was built after the castle was taken by Philip II in 1204, and the Plantagenets lost control of the area. The thickness of the walls and the staircases connect 3 floors. Here is one of the rooms in the bottom floors. It would have been uncomfortable, but not nearly as awful as the interrogations that followed. Within these thick walls, de Molay and his brothers faced torture, and this was supported by both the political and the church leadership at the time. As with the later treatment of Joan of Arc, the leadership of the Catholic Church was influenced initially by political motivations and supported the use of torture. Just as the church later recognized its mistake in the case of Joan, it also faced criticism and eventually recognized its mistake in the persecution of the Templars. It was a complicated story. In March 1314, Jacques de Molay faced a horrible fate. He was accused of heresy and other crimes and was burned at the stake in Paris. As the flames consumed him, he famously cursed both Philip IV and Pope Clement V, declaring that they would soon meet divine retribution for their acts. Little did these two know his words would resonate with chilling accuracy. We know why Philip IV was so intent on disbanding the Templars. At the heart of it all was money and power. He wanted to evade his debts, acquire land and wealth, and consolidate his power at any cost. His ruthless policies against the Templars were part of a broader strategy to strengthen the French monarchy. But just 8 months after de Molay's execution, Philip's reign came to an abrupt end. He died on November 29, 1314, under mysterious circumstances. Some say it was a stroke, others say it was a fever or a heart attack. Many viewed his sudden demise as a direct consequence of de Molay's curse, a divine punishment for his treachery. Philip had help in his campaign against the Templars. Pope Clement V, elected with Philip's help in 1305, found himself entangled in a web of political intrigue. The papacy had its own issues with the Templars. Their growing power represented a potential threat to papal authority. Rich, powerful, and effective, the Templars made both the church and secular rulers wary of their ambitions. Clement's health had been declining for years. He was plagued with a prolonged illness that many believe was worsened by the stress and guilt, perhaps about his actions against the Templars. When he died near Avignon, many viewed his passing as a direct consequence of the curse. Clement's body was laid out in a church. As the clergy and mourners gathered, a candle fell. The flames set the draperies on fire, and the entire thing went up in smoke. Accounts differ in detail, but the common thread is that the Pope's body was partly consumed by the blaze before it could be rescued. One person saw this as the judgment of God, because Clement had been widely criticized for his corruption, his close ties to King Philip IV, and most of all, presiding over the suppression and execution of the Knights Templar. The death of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, had consequences that reached far beyond his fiery end. With the Templars gone, the crusading movement lost one of its most disciplined forces. Their absence didn't doom Christian efforts in the Holy Land, but left Christian power fractured, weakened, and distracted by troubles closer to home. In France, the story took a different turn. The Capetian dynasty, those were the kings of France, had risen to power in part by outmaneuvering the rival Plantagenets, who once ruled vast lands in France. That changed in 1205, when the Angevin king, John, lost much of his holdings to the French king. The Plantagenets never forgot those losses and never gave up. They were patient, ambitious, ruthless, and they were capable of waiting for the right moment to strike back. That moment actually arrived through a marriage. In 1308, Philip IV's daughter, Isabella of France, just 12 years old, was married off to King Edward II of England. Philip likely imagined this union would secure French influence over England, perhaps even getting the French king on the English throne. What he never could imagine was that Isabella's son would one day claim the crown of France in the name of England. In 1312, Isabella gave birth to Edward of Windsor, later Edward III. At first, his chances of inheriting France seemed pretty remote. After all, Philip IV had 3 sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, each ready to inherit the throne. But fate played quite a different hand. After Philip died, his oldest son, Louis, took the crown, but he died in 1316 without a male heir. Next came the middle son, under the name of Philip V, but he too died childless in 1322. The youngest brother, known to us as Charles IV, ruled in 1328, when he also died, and only left behind daughters. In the early 14th century, Queen Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II, found herself caught in a storm of politics and betrayal. Edward II's reign had been weakened by disastrous wars in Scotland and his scandalous favoritism toward courtiers like Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer. Isabella, alienated and humiliated, struck back. In 1325, she traveled to France and refused to return. There she formed an alliance, political and romantic apparently, with the exiled Baron Roger Mortimer. Together they raised a small army, landing in England in 1326. Support for Edward II collapsed almost overnight. His hated favorite, Despencer, was executed, and the king was forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, who became Edward III. Edward II soon died in captivity under suspicious circumstances, but Isabella and Mortimer overplayed their hand. Though they ruled in the young king's name, their government grew weak and despotic. Mortimer enriched himself, seized lands, and even had rivals executed. Isabella lived lavishly, while Edward III, now in his late teens, simmered under their control. In 1330, the 18-year-old king struck back. With a band of loyal knights, he staged a daring nighttime coup at Nottingham Castle, capturing Mortimer in Isabella's own chambers. Mortimer was executed for treason, and Isabella was placed under comfortable house arrest. Edward emerged as the true ruler of England, ending the shadow regime of his mother and her lover, beginning one of the most powerful reigns of the Middle Ages. Suddenly, Isabella's son, Edward III of England, had a claim. The French nobility, however, refused to place the crown on Edward's head. They chose one of Philip's cousins, Philip VI of Valois, founding a new dynasty. This decision planted the seeds of war. When Philip VI later seized Edward's holdings in Aquitania, the young king struck back. By 1340, his supporters declared him King of France, a claim backed with steel and strategy. Edward's victories at sea in 1340 and on land in Crécy in 1346 marked the beginning of what we now call the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was, at its heart, a dynastic struggle. Two royal houses, the Plantagenets, mostly of England, and the Valois of France, each reached for a second throne, unwilling to settle for what they already possessed. This clash coincided with the arrival of the Black Death. War and plague together devastated both kingdoms. Fields lay untended, population plummeted, and the very foundations of medieval society, agriculture and feudal bonds, began to erode. For a brief shining moment, Henry V of England seemed to have triumphed. By the terms of the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, he was declared heir to the French crown. But fate intervened. Henry died before he could sit upon that throne, and his dream of a united kingdom slipped away. But that is a tale for another time. Did people in the Middle Ages imagine that the immolation, the burning at the stake of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templar, was responsible for the 100 Years' War? Over the next generation, Philip's sons died without heir, plunging France into a succession crisis. That crisis gave Edward III of England a claim to the French throne, and in 1337, the 100 Years' War began. For many in the Middle Ages, the war, the famine, and even the Black Death weren't just bad luck. They were seen as the shadow of de Molay's curse, a divine punishment on the French crown for destroying the Templars. Thank you for joining me in this episode of The Armchair Traveler Investigates. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide.